Let's open it up. We've got a mic in the back of the room, and you're going to need to speak into it for purposes of the posterity recording that is underway, and therefore you're also going to have to identify yourself, Janet.
I'm Janet Hansen. Is this on?
I think so.
With the Committee for Economic Development. I have a question for Dr. Greer. I want to follow up on this issue about differentiated pay by school or by subject matter. I'm enough of an economist that I know the labor market issues when we don't have that kind of pay and the distortions that it creates in terms of being able to get people into certain fields of schools. I can also imagine that those kinds of policies can seem arbitrary to teachers. So I'm wondering, as you all have managed to implement this, have you developed approaches? I'm deliberately not using the word process here because I don't see this as a teacher association school district process, but I'm really wondering, have you found ways of identifying which schools and which subjects that you can roll forward, because presumably those will not stay the same schools and the same subjects for all time. So how do you approach that?
Well, basically, we started with our most impoverished schools that had the highest degree of teacher turnover and who had the lowest student academic performance in those schools. Schools who had the youngest teachers with without the most advanced degrees. That's where we started from. And then we started with mathematics because without question it was our most difficult to staff position. Now, a few years ago, we started with special education because we started the school year one year with 38 vacant special education positions, and we convinced the board that year to allow us to pay special education teachers 2 salary steps higher than we did any other teacher in the district. We've not started the school year with a special education vacancy now in 4 or 5 years. And we've had other teachers in surrounding districts apply, and when kids graduate from college, they know if you want to start out making $34,000 a year versus $32,000, you come to Guilford County. Now, that's kind of taking care of itself, but we didn't lower the salary back down once we started filling those positions because, frankly, if we had, we'd still had those vacancies. And I really believe that it is market-driven, and if I believe we pay math teachers more because we can't find good math teachers. And we're finding some of our schools that we're having a similar problem right now with science teachers, particularly physics teachers and chemistry teachers. Last year, the University of North Carolina system graduated 1 physics teacher.
Maybe this question's moot right now, but I think what she's getting at is once you create one of these differentiations by subject or by school, is it then forever? Or is there the opportunity to redirect those resources to another scarcity? Should another scarcity become, or another problem become more acute a year or 2 or 5 down the road?
I'll be frank with you, I don't know the answer to that question.
You didn't have the opportunity to test that one.
We really have. I don't think you're going to have that opportunity because I don't think, as long as the market continues to pay math teachers right out of college $50,000 and you're beginning pay for teachers is $32,000, your best mathematicians are going to go into the business world, not into your classrooms.
So for the moment, this is hypothetical as to whether baking this into the
That's right,
compensation arrangements is temporary or permanent. Okay. Next. Yes, sir. Bring the mic up here.
Mark Simon, Tom Mooney Institute for Teaching and Leadership. My question, I don't know if it's a question, but
it better be.
It's to Checker and to Rick, and it's about the study, because I think that the focus on the collective bargaining agreements and on unions, I think, is good. It's important. The question is whether the frame that you created is really a useful frame or not, and whether we should really pay any attention to the rankings that come from that frame. I was the teacher union president in Montgomery County for 12 years.
Montgomery County,
Maryland.
There's one in Ohio and several other states.
And Pennsylvania. And we created a great contract. I mean, it's a contract that begins with a preamble that talks about student achievement and no student has a right to fail. It creates a professional growth system for teachers. that has teachers putting a huge amount of time and energy into their own preparation. It creates a peer review system. We created a process for intervening in low-performing schools. The question is, do the ratings that you created in this study, which really only deal with one issue, which is there, or how much flexibility do managers have? The question is that a useful way to look at collective bargaining agreements, even on the issues that you looked at? So on compensation, for example, very important issue right now to consider whether unions and districts are doing the right thing. You know, do we need to come up with different compensation systems? Is the issue that we should be focused on how much flexibility do principals or central office have to pay teachers anything they want? Is that the most important issue? I don't think it is. So when I look at the rankings and ratings, and Montgomery County was right in the middle, and you missed every important issue that that collective bargaining agreement addresses, why should we take these rankings and ratings in this study with this frame seriously?
All I will say before letting Rick answer it is we did ask him to look at management flexibility in collective bargaining agreements. We didn't ask him to look at 1,000 other things. But he always has a larger perspective than I do, so why don't you answer this yourself?
Yeah, and of course it's a reasonable question. I think, you know, when we look at any claims of triumphs on these kinds of things, it's always reasonable to ask, do I accept the premise? And so I try to be very, transparent about the premise. Kobe and I worked from the assumption that when we think about trying to equip schools to serve kids effectively in this day and age, we think it's important that schools be able to allocate resources, allocate dollars in ways that help them attract the teachers they need. And to us, that means that schools and school systems need flexibility in making sure they're able to bring teachers to the schools that are hard to staff, make sure they find educators who have skills that are more difficult to find, have some flexibility to reward educators that seem to be more effective at their work. If contracts prohibit prohibit districts or schools from doing this, we think that's a problem. We actually are very careful here to make clear that we are not offering any best practices or models. I think there's a lot of sensible ways that districts might work on this. I think Terry talked about one model. There's a lot of others that make sense in different environments. So if somebody actually doesn't accept that premise, sure. Same thing with work rules. Same thing with with personnel policy. Is we have a set. Absolutely, we come at this with an understanding of what equips schools and districts. One strand again, because I think you're right. There's obviously a lot of other things going on, and we're not trying to do some meta-analysis of a platonic analysis of contracts. But I think this is a very important piece in determining whether or not school and school district leadership is going to be able to make reasonable determinations about how are they staffing schools, how are they compensating their professionals, and how are they organizing their work teams. And if one doesn't accept that premise, then sure, one ought to discount the study appropriately.
I want to call on Kate Walsh from the NCTQ, and while you've got the mic, would you also... I turned it on, but if not, swap.
The larger districts are easier to get than the first 50 districts that we've put on the site were a lot easier to get than the second 50. But it would be a mistake to say that they were publicly available. It took a letter to many a district to get the agreement, repeated letters. So it was not. Yes, technically, they are publicly available. Actually, no, they're not. So, but that being said, Rick, I want to challenge you on your decision to not see it as a neutral thing that a data point was blank. We felt pretty strongly that, in fact, it said something good about a contract, that the lack of formal language for how to deal with a particular management issue between a principal and a teacher was in fact reflective of a district leaving it up into the discretion of the school. So that when you actually put language in a contract, that inevitably ties the hands. And yes, one way or the other. And the other thing is, if you put something in a contract, it's there forever. A lot of districts have rules that once it's bargained, it's always going to be bargained. So I think you're going down a very slippery slope when you want these contracts to reflect all actual practice in a district.
Want to respond? Whoops.
Sure. I mean, it was absolutely we actually spent a lot of time thinking about how to code ambiguity and contractual silence. This is something I'd written upon, of course, previously, and Andy Rotherham and Jane Hanaway's 2004 Harvard book. Andrew Kelly and I did some analysis, some of which factored into the way that this data, of course, was collected. And I think our determination, it really actually comes back to points that Bill, that Bill and, actually all three panelists have made, which is that it's a mistake to understand collective bargaining agreements in isolation. They are very much a product. Steve Adamowski, who's now superintendent at Hartford, did a wonderful Fordham study, I think it was about 8 or 10 months ago, on leadership behaviors and the ways that the principals interact with their opportunities, that depending on the opportunities they have, the training they have, the skills they bring to the job, it affects it the way that they operate. So it's absolutely a mistake to look at collective bargaining agreements in isolation. Given that, given the realities of the way that boards tend to approach these questions, given the realities of risk aversion, given a number of the considerations, some of which I've written about in previous work, we came to the conclusion that ambiguous or contradictory language in contracts or silence in contracts would be a mistake to interpret that clearly as signaling one thing or the other. So we came up with the middle rating. Reasonable people can, of course, look at this and come to different conclusions.
And yet you did praise the skimpy green dot type contracts, which are presumably silent on just about everything.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. So the green dot contracts look a lot like, I had a long conversation with Steve Barr on this end of last week. It's a lot like your personnel policies, for instance, at a reasonably well-run private sector firm. It's what those firms typically have in their personnel policy handbooks. Barr has written into the contract. No, I think, Checker, your point is exactly right. Much of what makes a green dot contract work is the fact that it is backed by an infrastructure, a management system, and a leadership, which makes clear that they expect principals and educators to behave in particular ways. If you simply took a green dot thin contract and plugged it into schools or a school system which you did not have those elements, I would be surprised if you saw dramatic change. It is not the collective bargaining agreement in isolation. It is the collective bargaining agreement in conjunction with these other elements.
We've got time for about 2 more questions or comments. And yes, sir. I guess this is the working mic, right? All right. I'll
Thank you. Is it on? Okay, Reggie Felton, National School Boards Association. Again, to pick up on the issue of the weight that you actually gave when in fact it was silent doesn't appear to reflect all the negotiations that go on and what that means within that culture. I guess my point is that sort of make the assumption, I guess, that school boards would not move and principals would not move unless it was permissive language clearly, when in fact the fact that it isn't in there is the result of some negotiations that will allow various schools, not the entire system, granted, but would allow certain schools and certain school communities to move forward because they have a different mindset in terms of, the employees or the relationship, the leadership of the principal. And so I guess I'm a little concerned that even as you write it up, you don't go into a lot of detail about the pros and cons of why you did that and what it could mean, as well as the whole issue of leadership limbo in a more positive, aggressive environment, it would read opportunity, because it would say to those principals and to those teachers, because you do not have the restrictive language, here's a way you can move forward. And I'd like for you to comment on that.
Yeah, no, those are wonderful points. I think first, again, part of this is the interesting thing about collective bargaining agreements in the public sector as opposed to in the private sector. Part of what's operative always, and this is, not unique to education, it says nothing about the AFT and NEA, it's just a reality, is that when you do collective bargaining in the public sector, you're obviously subject to a lattice work of regulations and statutory rules and procedures and processes which don't necessarily kick in the private sector, which make any set of arrangements just that much more potentially constrictive than they would be if you weren't operating in the public domain, simply because that's the nature of public governance. So that's one thing. Second thing is, I think you're right that ambiguity and silence can mean a lot of different things. It can also mean the kind of stuff that Gail was pointing to before when she said, look, sometimes the only way you're going to get a contract done is you're ambiguous or you're silent on it. And what that a lot of what that means is going to come out in the wash. It's going to be a constructive implementation. And so again, that's partly why we were hesitant to regard ambiguity, particularly ambiguity when you had contradictory elements in a given contract, or silence as clearly permission for districts to take steps. And a third piece of that, let me just give an example, is what I often think of. I'm at AEI, which is a place that does a lot of foreign and defense analysis. And one of the things that comes up, for instance, consistently in the discussions about what we did wrong in terms of Iraqi strategy the last 4 years, is that the notion of counterinsurgency is that you want to have military personnel in Iraq trying to do non-traditional things to win allies, win over hearts and minds, and bring peace to that country. Now, the problem is when you want people to do those kinds of activities, that's not the kind of stuff that's in their cookbook. When you are a career military person, you're not used to behaving in ways that are in the ambiguous areas. You're not used to operating the gray lines. You're not used to giving $50 to somebody in a local village. This is generally the kind of stuff that can get you in trouble or get you court-martialed. On the other hand, part of the Petraeus policy was to make clear that these kinds of non-traditional behaviors were not only going to be tolerated, but were going to be explicitly backed all the way up the line of command, so that people taking these kinds of actions could be confident that their superiors were going to support them in doing what needed to be done to be successful. What I'm suggesting, the parallel, in case it's not clear.
It wasn't.
Okay. The parallel in the case of schools is that when we talk about wanting principals to be proactive about addressing ineffective educators, when we talk about principals wanting to be non-traditional, be unusually active, and when it comes to recruiting talent, when it comes to policing the quality of their teams, when we want superintendents to do the same, they are generally hesitant to do so for good reasons. Even those who feel competent or comfortable doing so have very little confidence, in my experience, that their higher-ups, whether that's the superintendent or the school board, are necessarily going to exhibit 100% commitment to their decisions at the end of the day, and there is a real chance that they will be left hanging if they take unconventional or unusually aggressive actions. So what matters then in these ambiguous provisions, if we are in another environment, or if I were confident that the standard operating procedure in school systems was in fact to back that kind of aggressive and creative and proactive management that you allude to, then I think I would probably be willing to think about this differently.
I don't think they're all in the NCTQ database. They're getting there. Okay, NCTQ improves its database. We can improve the questions we ask, and Rick and others can improve the kinds of analysis they do. I want to take one more question, provided that it has nothing at all to do with Iraq. And then before we wind down for the party, which is waiting to roll into the room, I should say, I want to give Terry and Gail and Bill each a minute to say whatever, if anything, they have been storing up and dying to get out before this session ends on the basis of the conversation. So a last question from whoever's got one. You in the back. And those who don't get their questions asked can buttonhole Rick or the panelists during the party part.
Michael Hartney, National Governors Association.
Okay.
I'm curious, I read the footnote about how other than tenure, state law really doesn't play a role other than a few other examples. If you could talk about those examples, what I had in mind was the law passed in California in 2006 that allowed principals to reject a forced teacher transfer in a low-performing school. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about what state policymakers can do if they want to get involved in where maybe district contracts are silent.
Yeah, that's a Rick question, right? Okay, and then a minute each for the panelists.
Sure. No, that's a great question. I mean, given the design of the study, obviously, what we were mostly looking at is cases where the state had taken the bat out of districts' hands by prohibiting certain kinds of actions, just given the focus. So really, it turns out that states are not doing a lot which inhibits the ability of local parties, the district and their negotiating partners, to build sensible flexibility into these agreements. So states don't have a lot of remedial work to do on that count. On the other hand, it's certainly the case that states could take a number of actions to encourage and support this. States might, for instance, come up with a state-level version of the TIF grant, in which districts, and this could actually make it easier for both districts and the locals to take a step forward on some of these less conventional policies. They could offer additional funding for a limited window of time, for 3 years or 5 years, for districts and locals that were able to reach agreements on some of these counts. States can certainly do more to promote transparency and awareness of what's in these agreements. Eva Moskowitz held hearings in New York City about 5 years ago, which are still sometimes talked about in this context, simply because her city council hearings were so unusual in that they boosted awareness of what goes on in terms of some of these provisions. Similarly, there are efforts to kind of look not necessarily at these agreements, but at their consequences. In Illinois a couple of years ago, a reporter had to do a FOIA to find out how many tenured teachers had been terminated between 1986 and 2004. Of the 95,000 tenured Illinois teachers, it turned out that 2 teachers a year on average had been terminated. One might argue that there were only 2 teachers a year that needed to be terminated in Illinois. Others might suggest that suggested difficulty working. Regardless, that kind of information can inform the debate and create pressure on both sides of the table to make smart, quality-conscious decisions locally. So I think there's a number of ways in which a state can be constructive and supportive if it chooses to do so.
In response to the question and in turning the mic over to Terry for a minute, I might quote from 3 sentences in the San Diego write-up in this report, which you all probably haven't seen. Quote, California state law preempts district bargaining agreements on several of the indicators measured in this category. Tenure and layoff rules are both governed by California state law and consequently do not receive grades. The state also requires schools to select the most junior teacher in a certification area when transfers are necessary and allows transferring teachers to bump their less senior colleagues, removing those 2 indicators from calculation for the transfers component of the study at hand. So there's quite a lot of action on the state law front, at least in California. And some of that, at least, we picked up in this in this analysis. Terry, last thoughts.
I thought it was an interesting study. I agree with most of what's been said today, that these are one set of indicators that you can look at that predicts flexibility. There's certainly many other components of a contract that hopefully that you'll look at in the future. It's hard work, but it's rewarding work.
Gail, last thoughts.
I've actually learned a lot from your questions. For me personally, the study falls flat, as do the recommendations, in part because I have learned the complexity of school districts and the complexity of relationships, and all of those things somehow have to be factored into this thing we call labor negotiations. It just has to be. Standing on its own, it just falls really flat for me. And then the other thing that just comes to mind, I am growing increasingly sensitive to the plight of teachers. And specifically, to my knowledge, they are one of the few groups of professionals where we tell them both indirectly and directly that you don't know what you're doing, that you don't have the solution. And I think if we want to see real reform, somehow we have to change that dialogue and give them the tools, the research, the extra training so that they can be professionals. I have seen great teachers who literally transform a classroom overnight. They'll take low-performing students, and you'll see 95% of those students passing on literacy and math. And then you see others who don't do so well. So I guess that's my parting comment. I would like to see us empower teachers because they are supposed to be the experts.
Bill, unless you were going to say the exact same thing as Gail.
Ditto plus. With regard to the study itself, I think if we use the study as a platform for dialogue around how we use collective bargaining, it can be useful. If we use it to publicize charts and rankings, it won't do anything useful for us. I think that if we continue to use collective bargaining as a tool to build relationships and to move school districts forward, I think that can be an effective tool for us. I would like us to remove something from our lexicon when it comes to talking about collective bargaining, and that's when we say that if we put something in the contract, it's there forever. Because you know what? I think that from the union perspective and from management perspective, we need to do better than that. We need to think about how do we continue to make contracts and bargaining nimble as we move forward through the years. I don't think a specific contract should be a contract that's in place forever. It should be a contract that's in place for the duration, and then we should continue to adjust the contract based on the needs of the school.
Like to join me in thanking Rick and the panel?